Most of you know Jeff Ryan, and Jeff is the civics and history teacher at the high school. He's also a baseball coach, of course, very successful baseball coach. Many of you will know him through that connection. One of Jeff's specific interests is Native American affairs, and he got involved in that, I understand, through winding up with a friend who was a Native American, and the guy happened to be visiting this fellow on the Flambeau Indian Reservation during the so-called fish wars, or the walleye wars, if you've heard about those. I'll talk about those a little bit as part of the talk. Anyway, every season, every year, Jeff fields 2 trips. First, in the fall, there's a trip with 8 students, and he has those students selected. He doesn't read the essays, but they write an essay and say why I would like to participate in this program to visit the Flambeau Reservation, learn about the Native Americans. And they pick the 8 best essays, and those kids then go with him in the fall, in the beginning of the school year. In the summer, he puts together a trip that anyone can go on. And so I said, hey, I'd love to do that after I heard him talk about it here at Kiwanis. Jeff also said that I should definitely thank Kiwanis because you guys support apparently these trips that he does with finances and so forth, and he said to thank you very much. So he appreciates that, and so do I. This summer we went with 22 people, and they varied from his daughter McKenna, who turned 13 on the trip, and his oldest son Jack, who was 22, and a whole bunch of his students from before. They go again and again. There's been some kids that have gone up there 12 times with him on these trips, and they have sort of a little family, almost. And I volunteered to be the grandpa in the family, at least for this one trip. I'm 2 generations ahead of them and 1 generation ahead of Jeff. So anyway, my personal interest in Native affairs is kind of threefold. First, I've always been interested in civil rights. It comes from my family. We've talked a lot about race relations and so forth over the years. The second thing is, Marcia and I were both born and raised in Great Falls, Montana. And there's several Indian reservations in northern Montana, and right outside our community there was a squatters community of 2,000 Blackfoot natives. When we were kids in high school, we didn't see them; they were invisible. And so I became aware of that fact and became interested in why is that? You know, why do we have an invisible population here in America? And the third thing is our church. We're a Lutheran church over here at Joy, and we belong to the Northwest Synod of the Lutheran Church in America, 200 churches in this portion of northwestern Wisconsin. And this year, they decided they would bring an emphasis to try to find out how the natives, what native concerns were. They said, you know, the Lutheran Church, of course, is very white. And so they said, people say, well, we'd love to be inclusive, but how can we be inclusive? There are no minority people around us. You know, our churches have no black people, essentially, and so forth. And then we kind of looked around and realized that we have thousands, actually, of non-white people in northwestern Wisconsin. We have 5 major Indian reservations with, for instance, the Flambeau, where I was, has 4,000 members, nearly 4,000, 3,900. So a lot of non-European descent people in this part of Wisconsin. And so I said I sure would like to go learn something about these folks. We went to the Flambeau Reservation. Let's see here. Would somebody like to maybe turn off at least one of these lights? If I can, may I use the cursor here as a pointer? Everybody see that? Okay, here's the Flambeau Reservation right there, and you can see Minneapolis is down in the lower left-hand corner here. It's about a 4-hour drive from Prescott. The reservation is about 140 square miles. It's, you know, roughly 12 by 12. I have some data here on it, which I will show you. It's near Minocqua and contains a lake, Pogama, Pogama, I've heard it called also, which is a fairly famous lake around here. It sits in the remnants of the Great North Woods. The land is not farmable. There's a large number of lakes, which I will show you about. It's very beautiful. Let's see if I can find how beautiful it is. There we go. It's a really beautiful place. Lots and lots of lakes, very clear and clean lakes. You know, large glacial stones and islands all throughout, and the natives on the Lac Flambeau Reservation, who are Chippewa, we call them. Many people call them Ojibwe, because that's the language they speak, and they call themselves the Anishinaabe. And that is their ancestral name in their ancestral Ojibwe language. Actually, there's several groups of Anishinaabe people spread around this part of the country, in Michigan, Wisconsin, and so forth. The area is, like I say, this is 144 square miles. Land ownership, 66.8% tribal and 3.7 fee land. I'll talk about that in just a minute. 260 lakes, just gorgeous places. Lots of fish. We'll talk about that too in a minute. Wetlands, 24,000 acres, and the forested lands are 41,007. You can imagine then, if it's all tied up with lakes and forests and wetlands, there's no place to farm. And we'll talk a little bit about how the natives wound up being placed on land with the intention of them farming. Let's see here. Let me talk a little bit about the land. As most of us know already, when the Europeans landed on the east coast of America, they claimed the land under a thing called the Doctrine of Discovery. And there was a pope in 1453, I think, in Europe, who said, if you are exploring, you know, Christopher Columbus and all the people who were exploring, you go out there and you explore it. If you find a place where the people are non-white and non-Christian, you get to stick your flag in the ground and say, this is ours. And so that's what happened. The explorers came to these lands and they stuck a flag in and found that the natives in this part of the country, and Caribbean natives and so forth, and in South America as well, the Aztecs and so forth, and they stuck the flag in and said, this is our land. So the land difficulties that the natives have today are actually descended from that doctrine, the so-called Doctrine of Discovery. Kind of interestingly, the Lutheran Church, where we were learning about some of these things, wrote a denunciation, if you will, or a repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery. They said this was unfair, it was racist, it was many bad things, and we basically stole the land from the people who already had it, and this was a bad thing. And then, of course, the question is fine to say that, and the next question is, okay, now what? You know, what do you do next? And so the Lutheran Church is exploring, what is it we do next? Giving the land back, of course, is probably not practical, because it's all occupied and owned by mostly white people. Ownership, interesting. There was a thing that happened called apportionment. Back at just before and just after the turn of the last century, the 1900s, the Indians had been pushed from the East Coast, of course, continuously as settlers came from Europe and kept settling and pushing the Indians further and further and further. And by about the time of the Civil War, the Mississippi River had been a lot of it had been settled east of the Mississippi River. That was considered the West, where we're Midwesterners, okay, and we aren't anywhere near Montana or Oregon. So we were considered the West in this area. The Mississippi was drawn sort of an arbitrary border, and the government said, okay, Indian lands are to the west of the Mississippi. And so basically what they did is they moved most of the Native Americans to reservations, set aside land, reservations west of the Mississippi. And that was called Indian Territory formerly. That was actually its name, Indian Territory. What happened, of course, is that the Europeans kept coming from Europe and kept settling. The Homestead Act was formed, and so the government set aside land and gave it to anybody who wanted to occupy it and farm it, improve it, so to speak. Well, of course, the Indian lands began to fill up, and so many of the reservations were basically shrunk and taken away from the natives, and smaller and smaller groups, smaller and smaller amounts of land were, quote, given to the natives under treaty. And I'll talk a little bit about treaty rights after a while. In any case, the Anishinaabe who came through Michigan, down through Canada, actually wound up settling this Lac de Flambeau reservation. Then a thing called apportionment happened. It was very interesting. The effort, of course, had been to assimilate the natives into European culture and European lifestyle. They said, you can't be hunter-gatherers anymore, there isn't enough land, and also that's very uncivilized. So you need to become agriculturalists. And so this thing called apportionment, they said, okay, we're going to give 180 acres, the title to 180 acres to a native family. If it's a single person, we'll give him or her 80 acres and actually give them title of that, a piece of paper. Of course, the idea of land ownership was entirely foreign to the natives. They would say, you know, very nice, a piece of paper, and what does that mean? And it was inexplicable to many of them. And what happened was, when they had allocated this land, like on the Lac de Flambeau Reservation, to all the natives there were on that land, there was still a bunch of land left over. So they broke that up in pieces and sold it to the whites, actual deed. So now you have natives living on these patches, and then you have whites living adjacent to them also on these patches. Some of the land was, come on, don't do that, let's see. I think I have the next one here. Oops. Okay, this will give you an idea of what the Lac de Flambeau Reservation looks like. A lot of water, a lot of forest, and so forth. Here's another picture of it. Let's see now if I can. Okay, land ownership. Roughly 2/3 of it is tribal land, and that would be land also owned by. That is land owned by the tribe. The land, however, is under the control of the federal government. The tribe cannot sell that land, and any economic activity that's on the land is controlled by treaty with the federal government. So if they want to put up a casino, for instance, they have to get permission to do that. If they want to devote the land to any other purpose, especially economic purposes, in other words, put up a business or something like on their land, they have to get permission from the federal government. This, of course, sort of splits the control of what you can actually do on the land. A third of that land up there is fee land, and almost all of that is owned by people of European descent. And of course, because it's lakes and forests and so forth, the majority of that land is used for either a hunting section, you know, a person will put aside 80 acres to hunt on, or they build a lake home on it. And needless to say, this kind of split control over this causes some conflicts, and it has caused some conflicts. One of the major conflicts that I'll talk about at this point was a thing they call the fish wars. What happened in the early 80s, and I'm sure some of you have read about this in the newspapers, what happened in the early 80s is the local white population decided that the natives were ruining the fishery because they had the privilege under treaty of spearing the fish. And mostly what they were after was spearing muskies, because they're big and you can feed your family for several days off of a large, you know, fish that weighs 30 pounds. It turned into actually a serious physical conflict. What happened was the European descent population, the non-whites or non-natives, would take their motorboats and try to swamp anybody who took a canoe out and tried to spear fish. They would surround the docks at the Lac de Flambeau village, where the Indians lived, and try to prevent the canoes from going out into the lake to fish. It was really interesting because it was actually a rather serious mistake, because the Lac de Flambeau run a hatchery and they put 3 million walleye and muskie fries into their own lakes last year. This is really an amazing thing. The 6 major tribes in northwestern Wisconsin run 6 hatcheries, and they put 11 million walleye and muskie fries into these various lakes, so they're actually replenishing and improving the fishery. So it was actually a mistaken idea. That was settled. The natives had to say, we have the right to do this fishing by treaty, and he took it to court, and the court said, yes, you have the right to do this by fishing. There's still people up there who are sore as heck about it, both on both sides. The tribal chief that or the tribal chairman that we talked to, a guy named Tom Mollison, half German, half Chippewa, is a tough old bird, and they shot at him a few times. So he said, I didn't mind too much until they started shooting, and that was not a good thing. There's still a prickly relationship between the 33% of the land owned by the whites and the rest controlled by the tribe. There is some land actually owned by native families. In other words, they bought it, or they kept these deeds and recognized what they were, and then the deed came to them. One really interesting thing, I didn't know about this until I took this tour. Much of the land in reservations all over the country, which was apportioned this way, became owned by a native family. The natives would either die away or move away, and their kids would inherit this land, but they didn't necessarily know it. So you'd have 180 acres that went to 5 children, and then they didn't know about it, and then they would go to 25 of their children, or some large number like that. There are pieces of land up there that are owned by 500 people, and the government pays, on the basis of the land, as part of the support of the natives, the government pays an annual fee for to support this land. And so some people will get a check for 12 cents. And they have, of course, it costs, $3 to produce the check. And of course, a lot of this stuff is just lost. I mean, nobody knows who owns this land. There are some pieces of land that are owned by thousands of people because of this generation. Weird land situation with the natives. Still a lot of conflict over it. Let's see here. Okay, let's see what I have here. We'll try this. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. I talked about the. By the way, the reason this apportionment took place was because an effort at assimilation. The idea is if you could convert the natives to agricultural people, like the homesteaders were, and like a lot of people were, then their culture would disappear, and it would become European culture, and you wouldn't have conflicts anymore. So it would all go away. Well, it hasn't gone away. The government was almost able to kill the Indian culture completely off with a program to take the Indian children out of their homes and away from their families and put them in boarding schools. How many of you know about boarding schools? Okay, several. I'll show you some pictures of a boarding school that's still on the Flambeau Reservation, or a piece of it. Anyway, the idea was that the children would be taken away by force, actually, and put in schools, they were not allowed to use native languages, native dress, or conduct any kind of native ceremonies or rituals. And the idea was to kill the Indian. This was actually written down. Kill the Indian and save the man. That was the phraseology. And nowadays, we think, oh my gosh, how could they possibly think that? But there were actually people who were kind of social engineers, and they said, this is the best thing for the Indian, to make them into Europeans, and then these conflicts will go away, and they can be happy people settled on the land. It did happen in some cases. Out in Montana, for instance, there are Indian ranchers. I have a cousin who basically quit ranching. He retired, and his ranch has been taken over by a native family and so forth. Good ranchers, but not usually. Unemployment on most Indian reservations is extremely high, 30 to 60%, and the reason is because they came from hunting and gathering to land which would not support hunting and gathering, and then asked to become agriculturalists on land which would not support agriculture. So unemployment is very high. A lot of there are some businesses on the reservation. I'll show you some pictures of them. Casinos is one. We'll talk about casinos in just a minute here. Marcia, would you tell me? I want to make sure.
It's quarter till.
Quarter till, okay. Okay, this is the group. I won't talk too much, but on the left you can see Terry Sizemore. And her husband Steve is kind of in the middle up there. Let's see, I can show, okay. Steve is up right in here. And young daughter McKenna, I don't see McKenna, but oh, right there's McKenna, she's 13, and Carrie and Steve Sizemore's 10-year-old was with us. So we had kids as young as 10 and people as old as 79. So this is really quite an interesting group. We camped and pitched tents on the native-owned campground. Nice campground, a beautiful place right on Lac de Flambeau. By the way, for those of you who know any French at all, Lac de Flambeau sounds like Flaming Lake, and that's actually what the name comes from. The reason is because when the natives fish speared for muskies and or for large walleyes, they will take a canoe out and hold a lantern or a torch up, and the fish are attracted and they can have a chance to actually spear the fish. They also spear the fish through the ice. Cut a hole, put a tent over it to make it dark, and they put little walleye, fake walleyes. They carve walleyes out of wood and use them as decoys to decoy the muskies in place. So kind of cool. Okay, anyway, there's Steve and a friend of his from college who were moving their tent and trying to get it around. We're very warmly welcome, I have to say. This group here, the people in the front, are a portion of the tribal council. The tribal is an elected council and an elected tribal chair. Democratic system, one person, one vote. Each tribe has its own government. The federal government, structures how those tribal governments may work. They can't have just any old kind of government, so they have to have this sort of democratic government. It usually works in most tribal areas. Some tribal areas they have quite a bit of conflict, because one family will take over a tribe, get a bunch of people elected to the council and kind of run everything. And you'll read about that in the paper once in a while. Okay, let's see. They took us on a pontoon ride around their beautiful lake, Lac de Flambeau. This guy here is a former tribal chair. This fellow I mentioned, his name is Malsum, and he's half German and half Ojibwe. They conducted some craft classes for us. We learned how to make dream catchers and so forth. This is the group working on that kind of thing. This couple here, or this gentleman and his two kids, his two boys, were making musky lures for us, and they showed us how to carve these out of wood. And the musky lures looks exactly like what you would think. It looks like a little walleye. And so they dangle the walleyes down on a string and fish with a spear, or either through the ice or off a canoe. This is a favorite way of us communicating. It's a talking circle. And it's a common way, not all tribes, but a common way, certainly among the Ojibwe. And it prevents a lot of chaos, because you sit in a circle and you hold an object, sometimes a wand, sometimes a feather or a group of feathers, and the person holding the feathers is the sole person who gets to speak at that time. It was very interesting, because some of these young people who've been there many times are just kind of want to talk about their lives, and you get to say anything you want in a talking circle. You talk about anything you like. Our native guests, our native hosts, I should say, almost always talked about life on the reservation, talked about their own personal lives, their family lives, and so forth. And that was how we learned about them as people. That was really a salutary thing. We had about 4 of these talking circles in various areas. This tribe has I'm used to Indian villages out west that are really, really badly run down. They really look awful. The homes are degraded and falling down, and the unemployment rate is really high, and there's lots of alcoholism, lots of drug use. The Lac de Flambeau Reservation has escaped some of that. Part of it is they do have a casino. It's interesting. The stereotype, of course, is that every tribe has a casino, and they make a lot of money at it. In actual fact, the last number that I heard was 10% of native tribes have a casino. And of those 10%, 10% of those, in other words, we're down to 1% now, make a profit. So only 1% of the tribes in the United States of America have a profit-making casino. Now we're used to, of course, Prairie Island, and Treasure Island and so forth, where they make a lot of money. And the reason for that is because they're near a population center of 3 million people. And a lot of people, especially retirees and so forth, love to go out there and gamble. I did have a trip, in fact I tried to show you pictures of it a couple of years ago, about a trip down the Missouri that I took on a raft. And I saw one of their casinos at the Cheyenne River bend of the Lakota Sioux. It was a small, about the size of this room, a small frame building which was supported by external money, you know, it's theoretically a money-making enterprise. The federal government contributes funds to it, but of course it didn't make any money because there was nobody there to gamble. So anyway, that's a stereotype that we have that is not exactly true. This is kind of an interesting picture. One of the guests was given a flag to hold to take pictures, and during the walleye wars, during the fish wars, this Native American flag had been superimposed with a picture of a native. And it was controversial, needless to say. Okay, let's see here. This is where the profits from the casino on the Lac de Flambeau Reservation go. This is a dental clinic. Gorgeous, relatively new, about 4 years old. Gorgeous dental clinic, staffed by mostly white dentists because the natives have not been able to train very many native dentists. They also have a clinic and a small hospital, also supported by the casino. Now, it's an interesting thing. The federal government says if you have any money coming to the reservation, either given by the federal government or earned on a business, you have to devote a certain amount to infrastructure. And some tribes will devote very little, an absolute minimum, to infrastructure and distribute the rest of the money among the individual tribal members. That's called a per cap, they call it a per capita award. The Lac de Flambeau have invested much larger fractions of their money in infrastructure. They have an elementary school as well, again mostly staffed by white teachers. They have a few native teachers, people who've come through the education system who have earned education degrees. By the way, it's a public school. Anybody can go there. They do have quite a few white students. The clinic is a public institution, and many people from Minocqua and other places go to this clinic. Same thing with the medical clinic. They're all public. Same thing with the lakes. Anyone can fish them. Okay. The natives have treaty rights, which are different than a standard fishing license, but anybody with a Wisconsin fishing license can go fish these lakes. So it's basically a public place, privately run. It's really strange governmentally. Anyway, this is the inside of the dental clinic. Isn't that gorgeous? So they're very proud of these things, very, very proud. The businesses, the actual commercial businesses on the reservation are relatively modest. They have a small grocery store that's probably 2/3 the size of this old Patax building here, this intermediate Patax building. They have Family Dollar and some bars. This is a really nice amphitheater that they built some years ago. It's called the Indian Circle. It's where competition in ceremonial dances, which you've seen video of on television and so forth. Indians dress up in very elaborate, yes?
So Mark, the gentleman that's pointing on the video there, do you know who he is?
Yes, his name is Brandon Tomes.
I believe he came to speak to our district.
I bet so, yeah. He's a good
Here?
friend of Jeff.
Jeff's. Yes, and
he's kind of the host of this.
Yeah, he was our host.
Yes, and I will say that he did a great job speaking to our intermediate students, and I think he had went to the other buildings as well. Remember that, Penny?
Okay.
And he talked about the importance of education,
Yes.
and then he talked about culture.
Yes.
And it seems like the Lac de Flambeau are really interested
They
in
are.
bringing all that education up.
And it
So
shows.
It's a great, yeah, he's a great person to have.
Wonderful. Again, he's also mixed race. Almost everybody's mixed race. Finally, you know, it's been 300 years. So almost everybody's mixed race. If race is an actual concept, anthropologists who say race is some melanin in your skin or not, and so maybe race is a fabrication. Anyway, this is a lovely facility, and this is they do not hold their powwows here. We'll talk about powwows briefly. I bet I'm down to 5 minutes.
You're done.
Okay. Okay, well, zip on Brandon was showing us a typical, when these people were nomadic and moved from place to place, this would be a typical dwelling. And it's not called a teepee or a wiki-up, it's called something else, I can't remember. This is their casino. It's relatively small. It makes enough money so that they are able to support this infrastructure, plus they distribute about $50 a month on average to the individual. So it's not a huge payment. A lot of people say, the natives are rich, they have all this casino money. And you know, and on some casinos, the natives get thousands of dollars a year, but not here. So anyway, this is the boys' dormitory at the boarding school that was on this reservation, restored. It was tumbling down. There were 20 buildings at one time, and all of them had gone away, just tumbled down, except for this building. It was in terrible shape. They said, let's preserve it. And so they put a fence around it. People tried to burn it down because there were many natives who said, this is a terrible time in our history. Why would we want to remember it? But other people persisted and said, it's important we remember it because, you know, it's important that people know about this sort of thing. So anyway, this was the boys' dorm, and it was restored. This was a picture of the original boarding school. There were about 20 buildings, including tool sheds and so forth. The boarding schools were intended to train, this is a class, were intended to train the natives. Notice the absolutely European dress. You look like a confirmation class, don't you? Yeah, you know, train them in agriculture and some other skilled trades. They came pretty close to destroying the culture, pretty close. You know, by the way, the last boarding school closed. I couldn't believe this in 1956. The last boarding school closed in 1956. This was a large group of boys from the boarding school. You can see the variation in age.
Very small.
These are the kids inside. Our group got to tour, and they have converted this into a very nice little museum. And the sweet irony of all this is they have a little auditorium, a little meeting room about the size of this one classroom, and that's where the Flambeau anthropologists, I mean, people who serve them as anthropologists and so forth, are conducting the classes in an attempt to recapture the culture. So anyway, this is a bunch of children dancing at the powwow. We went to a powwow on Sunday, and Saturday afternoon. The powwow is a commercial festival. It's like Prescott Days. Okay, it's made primarily for people to come in and spend their money watching. The competition dances are done in that circle that I talked, the concrete circle that I talked about a little later. And there's a very steep competition among the native tribes. They don't call their regalia costumes because that implies something like Halloween. They say it's regalia or native dress. And this is a bunch of little kids. Everybody dances. Heck, I got to dance. Anyway, some of the regalia is very, very elaborate. Beautiful things, handmade. And here's a gentleman, quite elderly gentleman actually, in his regalia. This was the Veterans March. I got to march in that. It's an amazing thing. You'd think that since the U.S. Army were the ones who actually forced the Indians to consolidate and killed a lot of them and forced them out of reservations, they would not revere the Army. But I think it's because they were warriors. And they really revere the veterans. They just treat the vets really, really well among the tribal, you know, the natives who served in the military. Very proud thing to do, go serve in the U.S. military and come back to the tribe. So anyway, like I say, commercial festival, booths where they sell hot dogs and fry bread and so forth. A lot of people come. This is a privilege here. We got a chance to, the casino provided a meal, fried chicken and pork and vegetables and potatoes and so forth, and we got to serve it. So our group set up a system here and served a meal to everyone at the powwow. A beautiful place. That's the end of it. You always have to end with a sunset, you know, or pretty close to end. I have one more picture, of course, of these 5 beautiful children.
Those are our grandchildren. And maybe they have native blood.
Anyway, that's our grandchildren. And one of his name is Ava. Okay. This one's name is Ava.